Just wanted to start off by saying thank you for inviting me to be here and to present this research that we conducted in Fiji to you. I'd also like to start off with an acknowledgement of country and to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the lands that we're on today and pay my respects to elders past and present. All right, so I've been asked to give a kind of brief overview of what types of mental health impacts we might be expecting as a result of climate change, because this is sort of the area that I work in as a clinical psychologist. So I'm just going to give you a bit of a brief review of the proposed pathways. So climate change has been proposed to impact mental health via a number of different pathways, and these are direct. And so this is going to be direct exposure to the kinds of acute and subacute climate stressors that we're likely to experience. So acute being things like major storms, bushfires, heat waves, and floods. Subacute being climate stressors such as sea level rise, higher than average temperatures, and drought. Indirectly are going to be the kind of consequences of for the people who experience these direct impacts. And so that's going to be things like social disruption, migration, water and food insecurity, and reduced access to physical and mental health services. And then one of the other impacts is what you may have been hearing a lot about lately, potentially in the media, and what we might call impacts of awareness of climate change. So these are going to be things like eco-anxiety or climate change anxiety, solastalgia, which is sort of the sadness experienced by watching a place that you value deteriorate, and was coined by an Australian philosopher, as well as just grief and despair. Now, I just want to emphasize here that the expectation here is that climate change is going to be a threat amplifier. So it's not expected to create new diagnoses, but we do expect to see a greater presentation of sort of clinical pathology following these kinds of events. And the empirical research over the past 10 to 15 years since this has come to sort of awareness supports largely what we were expecting back then. So we do see increased rates of psychiatric disorders and symptoms of depression, anxiety, stress, post-traumatic stress, sleep disorders, substance misuse, and interpersonal violence in the aftermath of extreme weather events. And there's also a great deal of research that is supporting the existence of many different emotions, mostly negative, related to climate change and its impacts and climate change awareness. And I just want to emphasize here too that eco-anxiety is not a diagnosable disorder, but that doesn't mean that it can't have mental health impacts itself. So it is something that is relevant to this area. And researchers have also repeatedly noted that as with many stressors, it's going to intersect with pre-existing vulnerabilities, and it's not going to impact everybody in the same way. So uniquely vulnerable populations have been identified, such as young people, women, people living in certain geographic areas that are at higher risk, people whose employment requires that they work outside, as well as Indigenous peoples. And this is the main focus of the study that I'm presenting today. So the sort of idea of eco-grief was coined by Kinsella and Ellis in 2018 as an experience that's felt in relation to both experienced and anticipated losses of species, landscapes, and cultural systems of land-based knowledge. Now, a number of factors are likely to increase the vulnerability to experiences of eco-grief related to climate change in Indigenous peoples. And firstly, we've got that climate change directly threatens the integrity of the land itself. So those who are engaged in subsistence lifestyles are obviously going to be at higher risk, facing physical health and financial challenges related to food production and nutrition. For those who are living in coastal areas, sea level rise may ultimately make lands uninhabitable, which may force migration, and we'll talk a little bit about that in a bit. The strong place-based attachment evident in many Indigenous peoples may act as a unique vulnerability factor when traditional lands and landscapes are threatened by climate change, which may also potentially result in negative mental health consequences. And the inability to engage in traditional cultural practices, either due to degraded landscapes that no longer support them, or because they've been forced to migrate, threatens cultural continuity and identity at the community level, and also is potentially associated with grief and loss at the more personal level. Much of the work that's been done in this area has been done with Inuit and other circumpolar peoples. And while it's beyond the scope of this presentation and my time limit to dig into those findings, there's a growing body of evidence that eco-grief is being experienced by many of these groups as the polar ice caps melt. There has been some work that's been done on Pacifica populations, but not a great deal yet. And so that sort of leads us to the current study. Now, given more calls for data on mental health and well-being in the context of climate change, and particularly in the Pacific Islands, we aim to investigate that experience, the experience of environmental changes in Fiji. Now, Fiji doesn't tend to get a lot of attention when we're talking about climate change because it's not an atoll, like a low-lying atoll nation like Kiribati or Tuvalu. However, Fiji, it has been rated as highly vulnerable to climate change, and a number of coastal communities there have already been facing enough sea level rise that they've been told by the government that they are going to need to relocate. So the aim of this study was to understand the experiences of traditional Fijian communities with respect to climate change and how this related to their mental health and well-being. And we wanted to do this in their own words. So we conducted a qualitative study where we interviewed people from 7 different traditional villages. We conducted 14 interviews. 5 of the villages were located, as you can see, on the main island of Viti Levu, and 2 on the eastern island of Ovalau. And we wanted to get a mix of potential experiences. So of the villages that we interviewed, 4 of them were coastal. 2 of them were located in the coastal hinterland, and 1 of them was located in a river delta region. And village selection was also guided by the pre-existing relationships that members of the research team had, as well as our local interpreter, because otherwise we just wouldn't have been allowed to enter the villages at all. All in all, we ended up interviewing 71 Indigenous and other traditional Fijians. The mean age was about 50. I'd love for it to have been a bit younger as well, but maybe that's the next study. There was approximately an even gender split between men and women, mostly group interviews, but we did have a number of individual interviews with key members of the communities, such as the village headmen or chiefs. The interviews were conducted mainly in the Bowen Fijian language, with some regional variations as required. And the basic structure of what we were sort of asking about, it was a semi-structured interview, but sort of generally speaking, we had some introductory questions about the village itself and its history, questions about their experiences living in their local villages, including any changes in their local environment that they had noticed, how they felt about their futures in the villages, how they had managed any problems associated with changing environments and any future adaptations that might be required, what was their understanding of climate change and how it might impact them. And lastly, we asked about migration and if they'd heard about any villages that had had to relocate and whether migration had been considered in their local context. Mainly, or just broadly for analysis, we recorded the interviews, we had them transcribed into English, and then used inductive thematic analysis to review them. And then the quotes that we used in the papers, we had them back translated into Bowen Fijian. But what we found, 2 major themes, and each of which had 2 sub-themes within it. So the first was loss of culture, and the sub-themes there were ecological changes that were impacting traditional life, as well as loss of resources, and anticipatory losses. So, and this is related to future generations and future loss of land. So I'm going to discuss these more in depth on the following slides, and I've provided some key quotes to help kind of highlight what people were telling us. So there were key sources of grief, loss, and sadness reported from all of the villages, and all of the interviews that the interviewees that we spoke to had described ways in which climate-related changes were contributing to the loss of traditional ways of life and broader cultural practices. So there were impacts on agricultural yields and marine life availability that limited the viability of subsistence farming and fishing, and this seemed to be related to the younger generations not gaining requisite knowledge and skills in these traditional techniques and customs, which contributed to culture loss. This loss of village income also resulted in younger generations often opting to engage in paid employment outside of the villages, such as the many hotels and resorts that you've got on the Fijian Islands. And this also resulted in needing to purchase more food, compounding the loss of traditions through limiting engagement in traditional practices. Loss of animal species was something that was noted quite a bit as well, and also threatened traditional ways of life and culture, leading to grief. So some of the noted losses included species that held particular significance to the various villages, including certain types of fish and crabs, As the traditional methods of fishing were no longer being implemented, the younger generations weren't learning them, and this was again leading to more culture loss. Now, moving on to anticipatory grief, many of the villagers expressed anticipatory worry and concern about their futures related to these experiences, which caused distress. And in light of the changes in the environment already being observed, the villagers described their worry about the future impacts of climate change with a repeated expectation about worsening conditions in the future. And this also led to specific concerns and anticipatory grief about the impacts on their children, on their families, and on future generations. And then finally, future loss of land. The distress also related to potential migration or relocation as a possible solution to rising sea levels and agricultural changes. Migration represented a substantial anticipated loss, especially with regard to loss of land with which the villagers had a history and connection. So to summarize the main findings, our findings aligned with earlier results suggesting that ecological grief can emerge in response to these gradual ecological changes, including due to loss of traditional ways of life and land-based knowledge and anticipatory loss of culture. The inability to pass along traditional knowledge and customs around subsisting from the land to younger generations was identified as a key source of grief. And we observed that traditional culture was being impacted in multiple ways, all of which served as sources of concern and sadness. And I also just want to emphasize here, too, that the threats to culture have been reported to impact capacity to adapt to climate change. So even beyond simply suffering from these experiences, the mental health threats of climate change can also impact adaptive capacity, which can potentially result in a vicious cycle. Some of our recommendations from this research, the results align with calls for greater consideration of the preferences and perspectives of Indigenous and traditional islanders and their desire to remain on their traditional lands, and that this is needed when considering migration and adaptation strategies. I want to also acknowledge that Western mental health frameworks may not be compatible with cultural understandings of mental health in the Pacific region, and there remains a need for culturally informed and appropriate approaches to assessment of and interventions for mental health, obviously, as well as more research. And I'd also like to finish by emphasizing the broader strength and resilience of Pacifica peoples, and in this case, the Indigenous Fijians. To note that the Pacific peoples have been coping with and adapting to climate variability and changing landscapes for millennia, and many do reject the notion of sort of the environmental migrants as victims, framing of their experiences. And just to note that nobody's really doing anybody favors if we're framing people as victims, as this generally tends to have the effect of reducing agency and resiliency. Any programs that we create to address these issues should be co-designed and utilize existing strengths such as spiritual beliefs and community-based decision-making governance structures. And I'd just like to end with acknowledging all of the many people who helped work on this project in their various respects, and particularly to all of the villages who so warmly welcomed us. Thank you.
Thank you. What an amazing talk, and also like very important research.
Thank you.
Are there any questions? Okay, I do have one.
Okay.
Because if we think about some of the other issues in general with climate change and the effects of climate change, it's often that the people that are the most contributing to things changing are not the ones suffering. So I was wondering, is there a notion of maybe angriness in those people? Because I assume they are not contributing to climate change.
No, they're not. Not much. And we found a really interesting thing when we were there was that a lot of the villages are kind of, there's a word for this, and I can't remember what it is, but they're sort of skipping over some aspects of development. So rather than going the kind of coal-powered route for energy production, they've skipped over that, and a lot of the villages are getting solar panels, at least the ones who can afford them. So they're actually becoming even more sustainable than they would be anyway. Look, we didn't sense a lot of anger when we spoke to them, although certainly you're absolutely right that and this is pretty well known, that the people who are contributing the least are generally being impacted the most. I think it was more just kind of sadness and just wanting it to stopped. Like I mean, it's interesting because just recently, like as in yesterday, they opened up applications for Tuvaluans to move here. And they're like, Australia is going to take 280 a year, and 3,000 people applied on the first day. That's like a third of their population. So it makes the migration question really interesting because there's a lot more to it. But no, I see that a lot in my young people who I interview and research, but I didn't see it so much with them.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. Yeah.
I don't know if this is working. It is. Okay. Thank you for the great talk. My question is, are there, I mean, you kind of answered, I think, a little bit, but are there any examples of initiatives to, I don't know, from either government or other organizations to mitigate the impact or eco-green specifically in Indigenous or other populations?
Yeah, look, I don't know anything about, I can't think of anything specifically to mental health. Physical health gets a lot of attention, which I think you'll be hearing about here in a minute, and rightfully so. But yeah, there definitely are starting to be some initiatives with offering migration. So mainly, and this is again specific to sort of Pacifica populations, but Australia and New Zealand both have programs, and New Zealand had them earlier, and then opening it up a little bit at a time, but it's interesting to see how many people sort of jumped on that so quickly, because applications are still open until July 19th. But yeah, as far as the mental health, I haven't come across that. I know that they're aware of it in the islands, but you know, we're dealing with developing nations that don't have a lot of you know, financial support or supportive systems and healthcare systems to kind of address everything. So yeah, I'm not really sure if it's kind of at the top of the list, but I imagine it will be at some point.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, is there any more questions? Okay, then let's
Thank you.
thank Amy again.